what we're probably going to see unveiled is a plan to try and unlock some of the interest that has been accrued on 200 and something billion worth of Russian assets that's been frozen from entities and people who've been sanctioned, to try and use it to give a $50 billion loan to Ukraine to try and help that country to rebuild itself and help it with the war effort. Obviously, after the efforts of Joe Biden to try and get a 60-something billion plan through Congress were much delayed, and as a result, that stalled the famous Ukrainian attempt to, fight back against Russia. And that is one of the things on the agenda, but they're not all on the same page, these countries, on whether or not that's a good idea.
It's a big day in global politics as well. The G7 is taking place in quite a hot poolia, but is this the weakest G7 in its 50-year history? With the exception of Giorgia Meloni, the Italian leader and host, the other leaders seem to be on the brink of defeat, exhaustion, or both. Rishi Sunak's facing a defeat here, quite possibly. President Macron may lose his sudden snap election. Joe Biden's son has been convicted in a criminal court. Germany's chancellor has the most unpopular government in his country's modern history, and the Prime Minister of Canada is talking about quitting, and Japan's president is polling at a record low. Well, let's talk about all of that with Nina dos Santos, journalist and former Europe editor for CNN. Very good afternoon from us, Nina. When you read out that list, it is quite astonishing. How gloomy might this G7 be?
Yes, and detached from average electorate's priorities, right? That's the problem, isn't it? All of these leaders in these countries are facing the price, perhaps, of having focused too much, some might say, on foreign policy and not a cohesive set of domestic affairs. That's certainly the situation that Emmanuel Macron is facing in France at the moment. And others, like, for instance, Joe Biden, have managed to boost the economy in their country, but aren't getting much credit for it. What is sapping all the energy among the electorate is sort of foreign policy and big issues like, for instance, Ukraine and also what's happening in the Middle East. And this G7 forum is the very format at which 7 of the world's richest countries' leaders get together to talk about these things. But as you were quite rightfully pointing out, it has declined in relevance enormously. Back in the 1970s, these 7 most industrialized countries had about 70% of the world's economy. Now it's just a fraction of that. And frankly, the format of G7 gatherings that happen only once a year really is a format for informal discussions. Afterwards, they come out with a draft communique, but it's to steer policy in one direction rather than to make any strong commitments.
Is it more important this time around and last year, though, because of the situation in Ukraine? Because things are talked about at G7 that then do turn into action.
That's right. And you also have a number of other leaders that these countries can invite who aren't part of the G7, and that's exactly what they've done. So Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is the big guest this year. He's going to be having a joint news conference with Joe Biden, during which what we're probably going to see unveiled is a plan to try and unlock some of the interest that has been accrued on 200 and something billion worth of Russian assets that's been frozen from entities and people who've been sanctioned, to try and use it to give a $50 billion loan to Ukraine to try and help that country to rebuild itself and help it with the war effort. Obviously, after the efforts of Joe Biden to try and get a 60-something billion plan through Congress were much delayed, and as a result, that stalled the famous Ukrainian attempt to, fight back against Russia. And that is one of the things on the agenda, but they're not all on the same page, these countries, on whether or not that's a good idea. It sets a very dangerous precedent. Some nations, like, for instance, France and Italy and the UK, might feel, because there's large amounts of foreign capital that come to these countries, and that's a vital part of the economy. And if you're seeing these assets be frozen, then unlocked and given to another country to help with its war effort and to rebuild itself. But then those, assets then find themselves the subject of litigation. That's an uncomfortable position for some countries to be in. But as I was saying before, the G7 is essentially a talking shop to make promises and pledges rather than actually nail down concrete policy commitments.
Right. Is it quite a dangerous time, and I don't know whether that's the right word, and do replace it if it's not, for Giorgia Meloni to look superb and powerful with a lurch to the right going on in Europe that some of those attendees are going to be the victims of?
They will, but she has very deftly played her political position. You were talking earlier on in your show, I noticed, about Margaret Thatcher. Now, look, it may be that Giorgia Meloni, the first female prime minister of Italy, even though she is on the right of the political spectrum, and some outside of Italy might say, indeed, espouses some far right ideas, she is playing her political cards very, very astutely here. What she's managed to do here is essentially market herself as a transatlanticist to people like Joe Biden and those other G7 leaders, somebody they can rely upon for Europe's security. She's pro-NATO, she's pro-helping Ukraine. But on the other hand, she's also marketed herself to her domestic politics and domestic constituency as somebody who is further to the right, somebody who is going to tackle issues like migration and take this tough talk hard on. And she's also done something very, very clever at this particular G summit. She's trying to use it to pivot Italy towards a crucial point for access to energy markets to Africa. Now, this is important because countries like Russia, as I was saying before, are no longer part of big gatherings like these. I remember I was a correspondent in Italy 15 years ago, and I used to have to cover Vladimir Putin's presence at the G8 summits there in Italy. He's obviously persona non grata now, but Russia is pivoting away from big Western countries like this, thanks to the sanctions regime. They are trading a lot more with Africa. They're trading a lot more with countries like India and Saudi Arabia. India, indeed, has been invited to this G7 as well. And so Giorgia Meloni's very cleverly invited a huge amount of emerging market players, and she's trying to position Italy as that sort of transition point to keep Africa on board, to keep other countries on board, to keep her electorate on board, and also to keep, the transatlantic relationships and defence issues on board as well. Very clever.
How would you describe her current relationship with Rishi Sunak? And they have appeared to be pretty close in the past.
Yeah, well, I think that they have this shared passion for tackling migration, and migration is particularly an acute issue for Italy, especially when it comes to people coming across the seas from North Africa towards the island of Lampedusa. So they have their own small boat problem that has been extremely dramatic for many, many years. I've covered some of these landings, and it is really, really tragic to see. And now, obviously, this post-Brexit is a big problem for the United Kingdom, and she's managed to forge this alliance with Rishi Sunak over this very specific issue. She's also managed to copy and implement some of his policies much quicker. For instance, the Rwanda deal over sending asylum seekers to Rwanda to have their applications for asylum processed over there, that's been much stymied and thwarted by the courts over here. Well, Italy has this agreement with Albania where they're going to do the same. And indeed, that is further along the line there. And she's managed to negotiate that in a far more discreet manner without all the big uproar. So they have this sort of shared interest over tackling migration, but you could potentially argue that she's been a lot more nimble in how she's managed to sell that argument and actually implement it so far.
Yeah, I mean, she is quite a remarkable politician, isn't she? Whichever the side of the fence you come down on with her policies. Have you ever been to the resort, Nina? It's quite something, isn't it? I've not been there myself, just looked at the pictures.
You know what?
€5,000 a night.
I haven't actually. I have been to the other resorts where some of these other big summits have taken place, like, for instance, Taormina. I think that's famous for White Lotus watchers, maybe. I've been to some of those others, but this one, I admit freely, I have not been to in Puglia. I'm a bit jealous, if I confess,
It looks
here in
amazing.
grey
Yeah.
London. And I got Brussels 2 days ago, and that was, typically Belgian weather. But look, I'd take it even if it's obviously hot, and climate change, by the way, is one of the things they're going to be talking about as we speak, as they sit down after their lunch break.
Yeah, lovely bougainvillea. You probably didn't get that in Brussels. Lovely to talk to you, super stuff. Thank you very much. That's Nina dos Santos, journalist and former Europe editor for CNN.
I mean, I know it's not the biggest point of the day, but there is a real split in the weather, isn't it? Parts of Europe are absolutely raging in heat.
Yeah, and we're having the wettest June for a very long time.
Yeah, I nearly put the heating on last night, but I drew back at the last minute.
You just put your jumper on instead.
I did indeed, and a vest.